I will now turn my attention to the vote that will happen shortly, today or tomorrow, on William Barr to be Attorney General for the United and obviously Attorney General for the United States. Mr. Barr is a highly accomplished attorney and an experienced public servant with an outstanding record. The Justice Department needs good, effective leadership, and we should act quickly to fill this top spot. I believe that Mr. Barr will be a good leader for the Justice Department, as he has demonstrated in the past. In my opinion, at this Judiciary Committee nomination hearing, Mr. Barr was very candid with senators. I believe he did his best at answering questions on his views on a wide variety of topics, as well as addressing concerns, including my own concerns. For example, at the beginning of this confirmation process, I had concerns regarding Mr. Barr's prior negative statements on a subject that I've been working on for 4 years with Senator Durbin and Senator Lee, criminal justice reform. In particular, I was concerned about a 1992 Justice Department report released when he was Attorney General entitled "The Case for More Incarceration." That title ought to tell you he's tough on law enforcement. And also a letter that he signed in 2015 opposing the bill that we then entitled the Sentencing Reform and Correction Act of 2015. So obviously, if I think that we needed criminal justice reform for the first time in a generation, and the Attorney General puts out a letter against the part of it that Senator Durbin and I were working so hard on — by the way, the President signed that just before Christmas — then I think it's legitimate that I ask him these questions. As Attorney General, Mr. Barr will be responsible for implementing the recently passed First Step Act of 2018, which 89 members of this body supported. These members also worked tirelessly for its passage. The title, First Step Act, is the title of the bill that I call criminal justice reform. This is why one of my first questions during confirmation hearing was to directly and to clearly ask Mr. Barr if he would commit to fully implementing the First Step Act, considering the fact that he had written a letter 3 years ago against the concept. His answer was very clear and convincing to me, and that was one word: yes. He went on to say, and I quote, "I have no problem with the approach of reforming the prison structure, and I will faithfully implement the law," end of quote. Later in the hearing, other senators pointed to Mr. Barr's past stances on criminal justice and sentencing reform, and those members asked for Mr. Barr's current views on the subject. They also asked for assurances that Mr. Barr would dutifully implement the First Step legislation, just like I asked that question. Mr. Barr expressed his current misgivings about high sentences for drug offenders established in the 1990s. Each time he answered very clearly that he would dutifully implement the First Step legislation and work to ensure that the intent of Congress was realized. Mr. Barr's answers regarding the First Step Act relieved my concerns of his past statements. Now, while I'll continue to use the oversight powers of Congress to ensure First Step is applied and implemented as required by law, I believe Mr. Barr's testimony and look forward to working with him on both the implementation of the current law and future steps in criminal justice reform. I want to go on to another issue of importance to me that Mr. Barr positioned, and that was on the False Claims Act. If you remember my participation in the False Claims Act going back to 1986, that act has brought in $59 billion of fraudulently taken money from the federal taxpayers. Leaders and top prosecutors of both sides of the aisle have now praised the law as the most effective tool the government has to detect, prosecute, and actually recover public money lost to fraud. Most of the $59 billion has come as a result of patriotic whistleblowers who found the fraud and brought the cases at their own risk. In the past, so you know why I'm concerned about Mr. Barr's opinion, he was extremely critical of the False Claims Act, even after it was signed by President Reagan. He called it unconstitutional. At one time, he used the word, it was an abomination. So at his nomination hearing, I pointedly asked Mr. Barr whether he believes the False Claims Act is unconstitutional. He said, these are his words, "No, Senator, it's been upheld by the Supreme Court," end of quote. Mr. Barr also stated that he would fully and faithfully implement this very important law. He acknowledged the benefits of the False Claims Act and said, quote, "I will diligently enforce the False Claims Act," end of quote. I also asked Mr. Barr about his stance on something called the Grassley memo. That memo provides a long list of reasons that the Justice Department can use to dismiss False Claims Act cases. Some of these reasons are pretty vague, such as, quote unquote, preserving government resources. Just think how that can be used by some faceless bureaucrat to avoid some issue that maybe they don't want to go after fraudulent money or they don't like some whistleblower. So obviously those words can mean anything the government wants it to mean. Of course, the government ought to be able to dismiss obviously meritless cases, but we don't want broad discretion to the administration without good justification. But even when the Justice Department declines to participate in a false claims case, the whistleblower can, and in many cases still does, recover taxpayers' money. Although Mr. Barr has not yet read the memo, he pledged to sit down with me if problems arise. These are positive steps and positive statements. However, actions speak louder than words. So I want Mr. Barr to know that I'm going to aggressively monitor how he enforces and protects the False Claims Act to ensure that he follows through on his promises. Now, yet on another matter, during his confirmation hearing, I pressed Mr. Barr about transparency with regard to the special counsel's report. I made very clear that I want the report to be made public because taxpayers deserve to know what their money is being spent on. In this case, maybe $25 to $35 million. I'm not sure we have an exact figure, but it's a lot of money. The only way the American taxpayers and Congress can hold the government accountable is through transparency. You've heard me say many times, transparency brings accountability. Of course, there are some traditional reasons for withholding certain information, even in a special counsel report, such as national security or people's privacy. But there should be as much transparency as possible regarding the release of the report. During his hearing, Mr. Barr said that he'd place a high priority on transparency, particularly with the special counsel's Mueller's report. And there's no reason to think that Mr. Mueller won't be allowed to finish his work. Mr. Barr told me and other members of this committee that he'd, quote, provide such transparency as he can, consistent with the law and the department's longstanding practices and policies, end of quote. So there's a lot of room there for him to work within, I suppose, and still be honest in these answers. But at this point, I can tell you I have no reason to doubt Mr. Barr's sincerity or his commitment to transparency in the law. If he's confirmed, I'll be sure to hold Mr. Barr to his word on transparency. But I also realize that there are some differences of opinion around here on what is currently required under the Justice Department's special counsel regulations. So that's why Senator Blumenthal and I recently introduced S. 236, the Special Counsel Transparency Act. This bill would require by statute that a special counsel provide a report to Congress and the American people at the conclusion of an investigation, not just the Mueller special counsel report, but special counsel reports into the future. This is common sense transparency and accountability under any administration, not just the Trump administration. I look forward to working with my colleagues and Mr. Barr if he's confirmed on this important legislation. I also pressed the nominee on a number of other issues related to transparency and accountability, including Freedom of Information Act, as we call it around here, FOIA, and the Foreign Agents Registration Act, as around here we refer to that as FARA. When I served as chairman of the Judiciary Committee, I helped steer FOIA Improvement Act of 2016 into law, which creates a very important point, a presumption of openness standard. The Justice Department oversees the federal government's compliance with FOIA, so that's why we discussed it with Barr. So it's critical that the nominee, if confirmed, to lead the Justice Department takes FOIA and transparency seriously. When you talk about a presumption of openness, it ought to be this simple, that any of the public's business ought to be public, and you presume it ought to be public, and let the government give a justification why it ought to be kept secret or not open to the public under Freedom of Information Act. So I asked Mr. Barr if he agreed that FOIA is an important tool for holding government accountable. Naturally, he said yes. I also asked the nominee if he'd commit to ensuring faithful and timely implementation of the 2016 FOIA amendments. He said, quote, yes, we'll work hard on that, end of quote. I also think that the entire FOIA process would be improved if Americans didn't have to fight tooth and nail for disclosure in the first place. Now let me repeat that, fight tooth and nail for disclosure. That's why we have a presumption of openness when it comes to Freedom of Information Act. Getting the public's information out to the public automatically should be a top priority. So I asked Mr. Barr if he'd help advocate for more proactive disclosure of public government records. Again, he said he would. I appreciate Mr. Barr's assurance, and of course, as I've said so many times during these remarks on different issues, I expect to hold him true to his word. Then I went to the Foreign Agents Registration Act, FARA. I asked him about the importance of it. My oversight work has highlighted the Justice Department's historically lax enforcement of that act. I think we had a hearing on it, and there's something like, since 1937, there have been less than a dozen prosecutions under it. And now, all of a sudden, with Russia and Ukraine and a lot of other Turkey and a lot of other people, it's come to the attention that there's a lot of people that even recently haven't registered under it. On the other hand, I'll bet people are hastening to register very fast. But the law has some shortcomings. In an age where we're witnessing more foreign government efforts to influence the American public and policymakers, we should see more transparency and more enforcement against bad actors, not less enforcement. So I asked Mr. Barr if he'd agreed with FARA is an important national security tool and accountability tool. And he said yes. I asked Mr. Barr if he'd be sure to make sure that FARA enforcement, a top priority under his leadership. Again, he said he would. And I asked Mr. Barr if he'd commit to working with me on my bill to improve FARA. That bill before Congress is called the Disclosing Foreign Influence Act, to better ensure transparency and accountability. Again, he said yes. Again, Mr. Barr can expect that I'll hold him to his word. I also asked Mr. Barr about his position on antitrust enforcement, specifically whether he would ensure that the healthcare and prescription drug antitrust issues would be a top priority for the Justice Department. The candidate or the nominee responded that, quote, competition is an important factor in containing the cost of health care, and that he would work with the Antitrust Division to ensure appropriate and effective criminal and civil enforcement to protect Americans' interest in low-cost, high-quality health care, end of quote. He stated that if confirmed, antitrust enforcement is a healthcare and in the healthcare and pharmaceutical sectors will remain a priority for the Justice Department. I also asked the candidate about my concerns about agriculture competition. He indicated that enforcing the antitrust laws in the agricultural sector will remain a priority. The topics I just discussed are just some of the areas that I asked Mr. Barr about at the confirmation hearing and in written questions for the record. And my Judiciary Committee colleagues questioned Mr. Barr at length on a variety of topics. I take Mr. Barr at his word. I don't believe he would bow to any kind of pressure, even from the president, if he thought that there were a problem with the legality, constitutionality, or ethics of an issue. He is an excellent nominee, extremely competent and experienced. Mr. Barr previously led the Justice Department and has proven his strong leadership abilities. Recall that back in 1991, the Senate Judiciary Committee unanimously reported Mr. Barr's nomination to be Attorney General under President George H.W. Bush. And can you believe it? The Senate confirmed him by a voice vote. Now, what's changed after 25 years? I don't know, except there's something some people think is wrong if a person by the name of Trump nominates somebody to some office. It's the only difference I can see. He's proven himself in the last 25 years, even to be in the private sector, what he did so well as a public servant. A very capable attorney he is, straight shooter. He's willing to engage in productive discussion with Congress. That is a key quality that we want in anybody running the Justice Department. And I've had enough trouble with the Justice Department. I hope that he can respond to my request for oversight, information, more than Democrats and Republicans that preceded him. He's committed to work with me on my oversight requests, and I think my colleagues know that that's a responsibility that I take seriously. He'll uphold the law and the Constitution. Mr. Barr deserves our support, and you can tell from our remarks that I'm obviously proud to vote for him. I yield the floor.